Here's a question I think a lot about. Why is it that some technology executives consistently drive enterprise-wide strategy and innovation? They really secure that powerful, coveted seat at the C-suite table.
Right.
While others, who might be just as brilliant technically, maybe with coding or infrastructure, they seem perpetually stuck maintaining back-office systems, just handling trouble tickets.
Yeah, that's a critical question. And, for listeners really aiming for that C-suite level, that core difference often, well, it boils down to one fundamental non-technical competency: adaptive leadership.
Adaptive leadership.
It's really the ability to lead effectively when you don't have all the answers, when the path isn't clear.
Okay, that's the DNA we really want to dig into today. Welcome, everyone, to the Deep Dive. We're cracking open Chapter 10 of Strategic CIO Leadership by Dr. Joseph H.Schuessler.
A fantastic resource.
Absolutely. This chapter is basically the operational playbook for how high-impact tech leaders don't just, survive chaos, but actually thrive in it. So our mission for this deep dive is to explore the four big theoretical models that define adaptive leadership. We want to understand the practical tools CIOs use every day, things like the OODA loop, and maybe most importantly, figure out how to build that essential human capacity, what the book calls learning agility.
That's key.
That's what ensures you and your team can handle, well, pretty much anything that comes your way.
And we really can't talk about adaptive leadership without first, diagnosing the environment it's built for.
Right, context.
Exactly. The modern enterprise, especially for anyone in technology leadership, operates under conditions of just relentless, often chaotic turbulence. We tend to use two main acronyms to frame this: the classic VUCA and the slightly newer one, BANI.
Okay, let's start with VUCA. It's been the standard model for, 20 years now? Walk us through those four pieces.
Sure. So VUCA, it actually came out of U.S. Army Strategic Planning originally. It stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Volatile means change is rapid, it's large scale, often really disruptive. Think about sudden market shifts from generative AI, maybe, or a huge supply chain shock. Things happen fast and big.
Unexpectedly fast.
Right. Then uncertain means the future just can't be predicted with any real confidence. Past performance is no longer indicative of future results, as they say. Historical data isn't a reliable guide anymore.
Okay. And complex. That feels very IT-centric.
It does, doesn't it? Complex describes a system where you have tons of interconnected factors and they interact in unpredictable ways. The classic global IT infrastructure connecting partners, vendors, customers, data flows, it's inherently complex. A small change here can have weird effects over there.
Right, the ripple effect.
Exactly.
And ambiguity. This one always feels the hardest because it's about the information itself, isn't it?
It really is. Ambiguous means the information you do have is often incomplete. Maybe it's contradictory. It makes it incredibly hard to see clear cause and effect. You're basically forced to make decisions with imperfect knowledge.
Which happens all the time.
All the time. Now, if VUCA describes the environment, BNI, which really popped up around 2020 or so, tries to describe the impact of that environment, how it feels, how it affects systems and people.
And BNI seems to bring a much-needed human lens to all this chaos, doesn't it?
I think so, yeah. BNI stands for brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible.
Okay, break those down. Brittle.
So brittle means systems today are often, over-optimized for efficiency. They look strong, but they lack flexibility. So instead of degrading gracefully when stressed, they can just snap. Sudden catastrophic failure.
Like a glass pane versus a wood.
Good analogy. Then anxious. This reflects the stress, the fear people feel facing constant, unpredictable change. This is the emotional toll of nonstop transformation, the human cost.
That feels very real right now. Nonlinear.
Nonlinear means cause and effect are way out of proportion. Small events can trigger massive, chaotic consequences. A tiny, seemingly minor coding dependency issue creates a chain reaction that costs the company millions in minutes.
Yet the outcome just doesn't match the input size. We see that a lot in IT incidents. And finally, incomprehensible.
Incomprehensible just acknowledges that sometimes the sheer complexity, the flood of data, it's just too much to fully grasp, even for the experts.
Right.
There's a point where it kind of overwhelms our human ability to process it all. So the big implication, as you said, is profound. Traditional leadership, hierarchical, static, relying on annual budgets and rigid 5-year plans, it's just not equipped for this BANI world. It's almost guaranteed to fail.
So the adaptive leader is essentially the countermeasure to all this turbulence. What does that actually look like day to day?
Well, it means they consciously adopt specific behaviors, specific mindsets. To counter volatility, the CIO needs to provide a really clear vision, a sense of direction amidst the storm.
Okay.
To counter uncertainty, they prioritize understanding, constant learning, experimentation. To deal with complexity, they bring clarity through systems thinking, seeing the connections.
And for Banet's effects.
And crucially, to counter that brittleness and anxiety from BNI, they have to actively build resilience, psychological safety, empathy right into the fabric of the organization. It's a fundamental shift in mindset, really. Moving from being a controller to being a cultivator of adaptation. That's the difference we're talking about.
Okay, so if you are looking to level up your leadership mindset in tech, maybe preparing for that next big leap towards the C-suite, this adaptive capability, this is the core DNA you need. We really encourage you to follow this deep dive series and maybe share it with someone else who's getting ready for that kind of major leadership role. Understanding these models is absolutely foundational.
Yeah.
Okay, let's really unpack this now. The framework that seems to offer the clearest starting point, the best diagnostic tool for any leader, is Ronald Heifetz's model of adaptive leadership. We throw the word change around constantly, right?
All the time.
But Heifetz argues that the first, most critical step of leadership is diagnosing the type of problem you're facing. Can you walk us through his fundamental distinction?
Yeah, absolutely. Heifetz's work, it's really rooted in this idea that true leadership isn't about having authority. It's about mobilizing people, getting them to tackle the really tough systemic challenges.
Yeah.
And he basically split challenges into two main buckets, technical versus adaptive. And honestly, failing to accurately diagnose which kind you're dealing with, that might be the single biggest operational risk a CIO can take.
Okay, let's set the baseline first.
Mhm.
What makes a challenge technical
Hmm.
in an IT context? Give us an example.
Sure. Technical challenges are the ones that are, typically well-defined. We generally know how to solve them. There are established procedures, existing knowledge within the organization, or you can use formal authority to get it done.
Right.
It's a problem where an expert can basically step in, maybe consult the playbook, apply the fix. So for instance, if you have a known server vulnerability, applying the security patch, that's a technical challenge.
Straightforward.
Pretty much. Or upgrading a known piece of software to its latest version, assuming the data migration isn't crazy complex, that's technical. These usually don't generate a ton of resistance because the what and how are fairly clear.
Okay. But then you step into the adaptive space and everything changes. What makes a challenge adaptive?
These are the hard ones. Adaptive challenges are complex, they're often unfamiliar, and they fundamentally demand new learning, innovation, and critically systemic change across the whole enterprise.
So the solution isn't obvious.
Not at all. The solution isn't readily apparent. It actually has to emerge through, deep collaboration with stakeholders. And it often requires people to genuinely change their long-held values, their attitudes, or just the way they've always done things, their behaviors.
Can you give us a high-stakes example where this misdiagnosis happens a lot in IT?
Oh, definitely. Think about cybersecurity for a minute. Deploying a new firewall technology, that's largely technical. Getting every single employee to rigorously follow new multi-factor authentication policies every time and stop clicking on phishing emails, that's profoundly adaptive. It's about behavior change at scale.
I see.
Another classic example, which the source material details well, is implementing a big new electronic medical record system, an EMR.
Right. Huge projects.
Huge. The technical part, installing the servers, the software, yeah, that's complex but known. The adaptive challenge is getting hundreds of specialized clinicians, doctors, nurses who've practiced medicine maybe the same way for 20 years to completely overhaul their clinical workflows, their documentation habits they trust, their whole approach to patient data. That's the bear.
And I can see the risk immediately. A CIO might look at that EMR challenge and try to solve it with a technical mandate, right? Like more training sessions, a bigger project budget, stricter deadlines.
And that right there is precisely the failure mode.
Yeah.
If you try to mandate a cultural or behavioral shift using just a technical rollout plan, you hit massive resistance, often passive resistance, right? Nurses find workarounds, doctors maybe quietly revert to paper charts for some things, the whole project stalls out, budgets explode. The cost of treating an adaptive problem like it's technical is usually systemic failure, huge cost overruns, and frankly, the destruction of trust between IT and the business.
So the adaptive leader needs to recognize that difference.
Absolutely. They understand they need to lead with expertise for the technical components, sure, but they have to mobilize the system for the adaptive parts. They need to address the underlying fears, the values, the resistance to change, not just the surface symptoms of noncompliance.
Okay, since getting this diagnosis right is so vital, what specific behaviors does Heifetz say leaders need to exhibit when they are facing these tough adaptive problems?
He outlines a toolkit, really. 4 key behaviors. The first one is probably the most famous, get on the balcony.
Get on the balcony, okay.
It's this idea of having the physical and, maybe more importantly, the mental ability to step back from the chaos of the dance floor. You know,
Okay.
the immediate day-to-day operations, the crises, to gain a much broader perspective.
Seeing the whole picture.
Exactly. You're observing the patterns, maybe the hidden agendas, the power dynamics, how the whole system interacts without getting totally sucked into the details or the immediate firefight. You're diagnosing the health of the system, not just fixing one error message.
That sounds like it directly addresses that feeling of incomprehensibility in the BNI world by creating some distance. What about managing the human reaction, the anxiety, the fear that change naturally brings?
That's the second behavior. Regulate distress. Adaptive challenges, by their very nature, force people way outside their comfort zones. That generates fear, maybe grief for what's being lost, resistance.
Sure.
The adaptive leader has to consciously create what Heifetz calls a holding environment. It's like a safe, structured space where that tension, that distress can be managed and contained, not ignored.
So you don't pretend it's not happening.
No, you acknowledge the loss, the fear the change is causing. You might need to adjust the pace of transformation. You don't turn up the heat so high that everyone panics and shuts down, but you also don't turn it down so low that no real learning or adaptation actually happens. It's a delicate balance.
Okay. The third behavior feels like a complete flip of traditional top-down authority.
It really is. It's the act of giving the work back to the people. This is crucial. The leader's job is to define the challenge, maybe set the direction, point towards the North Star, but they explicitly refuse to provide the final, neat solution to an adaptive challenge.
Why not? Isn't that what leaders are paid for?
For technical problems, maybe, but
Mhm.
for adaptive ones, the solution has to stick. So you empower the individuals and teams closest to the actual work, the frontline staff, the clinicians using the EMR to find and own their solutions.
Ownership.
That fosters sustainable change because people just won't internalize or commit to a solution that's dictated entirely from on high. It effectively shifts the burden of adaptation from just the CIO or the leadership team onto the broader organization itself.
Okay. And the last one. There must be a way to capture those bottom-up solutions and make sure the leader is actually hearing them.
Absolutely. That's protect leadership voices from below. This means proactively seeking out and sometimes actively shielding those people who challenge the status quo. You know, the whistleblowers, the internal critics, maybe the junior staff member with a really unconventional idea,
makers?
sometimes seen that way. But these individuals often hold critical insights needed for adaptation. Their voices, though, can easily get squashed by bureaucracy or resistant middle managers or just the fear of speaking up.
Right.
The adaptive leader actively creates channels, formal and informal, for this collective intelligence to surface and actually be heard. It's about preventing dangerous groupthink at the top and tapping into the wisdom of the entire organization.
Okay, so Heifetz gives us this really powerful personal toolkit for diagnosing problems and mobilizing people. But a CIO also needs models that apply to the whole organization, right?
Yeah.
Thinking about it as this large dynamic entity.
Exactly. We need to scale up the thinking.
This brings us to 3 other major strategic frameworks discussed in the chapter. Let's start with one that really challenges the whole idea of top-down control. Complexity leadership theory, or CLT.
Right. CLT is fascinating because it views the organization not like a machine, but more like a living ecosystem, a complex adaptive system, or CAS.
Let's see, yes.
In this view, leadership isn't just located at the top of the org chart. It's networked, it's emergent, it arises naturally from the dynamic interactions of potentially thousands of individuals, teams, technologies, all bumping into each other.
So the CIO's role changes pretty dramatically then. It's less about being the heroic controller planning every single move.
And more about being an orchestrator, maybe, a cultivator of the environment. The job becomes fostering the conditions where self-organization and innovation can actually happen.
Okay, but what does enabling emergence look like on the ground in a real IT organization? That sounds a bit abstract.
It can feel abstract, but there are practical things. First, it means investing in the infrastructure that allows information to flow freely across the usual silos. Breaking down those data barriers is huge.
Right.
Second, it might mean funding specific boundary spanning roles, people whose explicit job is to connect otherwise disconnected teams like IT, marketing, and operations, and facilitate that cross functional problem solving.
Like internal connectors.
Exactly. And third, it means having the stomach to tolerate a certain level of, well, maybe inefficiency or redundancy in the short term to allow space for these emergent solutions to kind of bubble up from below. You can't optimize everything to the nth degree if you want innovation.
Okay. And the CLT talks about three distinct leadership roles needed in this kind of environment. Can you break those down for us?
Sure. First, there's administrative leadership. This is your traditional and still absolutely crucial function, providing structure, efficiency, resource allocation, the steady hand running the data center reliably.
The operational backbone.
Precisely. Then there's enabling leadership. This is
Okay.
that cultivator role we just talked about, fostering the conditions for learning, connection, emergence, creating the fertile ground.
Okay.
And finally, there's adaptive leadership itself. This is the informal, dynamic process of change that actually happens across the network as people experiment, collaborate, and adapt. The effective CIO in this model needs to make sure all three roles are active and balanced. You can't have continuous innovation, enabling adaptive, if your basic infrastructure administrative is constantly falling over.
Right, makes sense. Now, while the idea of a self-healing emergent organization is really appealing, I have to ask this, especially for someone aiming for the C-suite. Is CLT maybe a bit too vague? Is it truly actionable day to day? What's the professional critique here?
That's a very fair challenge, and it really hits the core nuance. While CLT is conceptually powerful, I mean, it perfectly describes the nonlinear, sometimes incomprehensible BANI world we're in. It often lacks extensive empirical validation in many traditional business settings.
Okay.
There isn't always a clear step-by-step implementation formula, so it often serves more as a high-level guiding mindset, a philosophy for how to think about organizational dynamics, rather than a concrete checklist or a proven methodology you just roll out.
So it requires judgment.
Tremendous judgment from the CIO. Knowing when to loosen the controls to enable that emergence versus when you absolutely must apply rigorous structure, especially in areas like compliance or cybersecurity, where the risks are just too high.
Okay, moving from that more abstract theory to something very tangible now. Agile leadership. This has fundamentally reshaped how many technology departments operate.
It really has. Agile leadership represents a huge paradigm shift away from that old school command and control hierarchy.
Right.
It insists on a culture of continuous learning, rapid iteration, and really deep customer-centric innovation. For an adaptive CIO, this translates into concrete actions like replacing those rigid, multi-year IT master plans with rolling, living 18-month roadmaps.
Or dynamic.
Much more dynamic, using things like quarterly goals, maybe OKRs, objectives, and key results, and actively sanctioning environments where teams are not just allowed but encouraged to experiment, to fail fast, learn fast.
So the Agile CIO is essentially trusting the self-organizing teams to deliver value incrementally and then constantly adjusting the overall direction based on real-time feedback.
That trust and adaptability are absolutely central. But here we hit that critical debate again, the agile reality check.
Ah, yes.
You have to be really vigilant against what's sometimes called agile theater.
Agile theater.
That's when organizations adopt all the visible rituals, the daily stand-ups, they buy the specific software tools, they have branded hackathons, but they don't actually embrace the fundamental cultural shift that makes agile work. Things like real psychological safety, high levels of trust, genuine tolerance for risk and failure.
Just going through the motions.
Exactly. So a CIO has to be highly discerning. Agile methods are fantastic for things like software development, R&D, rapid prototyping, exploring new ideas.
But not for everything.
Definitely not for everything. You wouldn't, for example, use an agile sprint cycle to manage the construction of a new, say, $100 million data center. That requires traditional stage gate processes, heavy regulatory oversight, intense upfront planning. It's capital intensive, high risk.
Right.
Applying agile, where traditional rigorous controls are genuinely needed, that's a failure of leadership judgment. The truly adaptive leader knows how to adapt the approach itself to the specific context, not just blindly apply the latest jargon everywhere.
Okay. Finally, to really grapple with that interconnectedness, the complexity, the C, in VUCA, adaptive CIOs need to become masters of systems thinking.
Yes. Systems thinking is such a crucial practice. It's about viewing the organization not as a collection of separate silos, but as a web of interconnected, interdependent parts.
Seeing the whole system.
Seeing the whole and understanding that the system's behavior is often really non-obvious, definitely non-linear. The goal is to move beyond just fixing the surface level symptoms, the immediate bug, and start diagnosing the underlying structural issues that allowed the symptom to appear in the first place.
So what does that actually look like on the CIO's desk day to day? How do they apply systems thinking?
Well, as a systems thinker doesn't just say fix a recurring software bug, they ask why that bug keeps happening. What are the underlying structural issues? Are there policies, team interactions, technical debt accumulations that are creating the conditions for this bug?
Looking for root causes.
Exactly. They might use diagnostic tools like causal loop diagrams. These help you visually map out the cause and effect relationships and, importantly, the feedback loops within the system.
Feedback loops.
Yeah, for example, a diagram might show a negative feedback loop. Maybe increased technical debt leads to developer burnout. That burnout leads to lower code quality. Lower code quality then accelerates the accumulation of technical debt. See the cycle.
Wow, yeah. That sounds like a powerful way to actually visualize that kind of downward spiral.
It really is. And that visualization, that mapping, helps you identify potential leverage points.
Leverage points.
These are places in the system where a relatively small shift, a small intervention, could potentially yield disproportionately large positive changes. In that technical debt example, the leverage point might not be just fixing the immediate bugs. It might be changing the organizational policy that forces developers to constantly rush new features without giving them dedicated time for refactoring and paying down that debt.
Addressing the systemic pressure.
Precisely. So when an adaptive CIO is planning something big, like a new core data platform, they use systems thinking to map out how that platform will ripple through the entire organization. How will it impact workflows? What new talent will we need? How might it even change our business model? They're trying to anticipate those second and third order consequences before they turn into major problems or disasters. We can talk about models and tools and frameworks all day long, but adaptation is ultimately meaningless if the people executing the strategy can't learn and change at the same pace as the external environment.
Right, comes down to the humans.
It always does. If technology is evolving incredibly quickly, then the CIO, their direct reports, their entire staff, everyone has to become a perpetual learner.
Yeah.
And this brings us squarely to the concept of learning agility.
And you mentioned something striking earlier, that learning agility has actually been found to be a stronger predictor of leadership success than either IQ or even emotional intelligence,
Yeah.
EQ. That's huge. Why is it so predictive?
It is huge, isn't it? Think about it this way. IQ tends to predict success in roles where the problems are largely technical and known, where there's a right answer you can figure out. EQ helps predict success in relatively stable social environments, navigating relationships,
Okay.
but learning agility, that's the raw potential to adapt. It's defined as the ability and the willingness, both are crucial to learn the right lessons from your work experiences, especially the tough ones, the failures, and then successfully apply those lessons in new, challenging, often unfamiliar leadership situations.
So it's about learning from doing, especially when things are ambiguous.
Exactly. It's the engine of potential in this constantly shifting VUCA and BNI world.
Okay, the source material discusses a couple of models to help us get a concrete handle on this. Let's start with the one from the Center for Creative Leadership, CCL. It talks about 4 enablers and 1 critical derailer.
Right. The CCL model gives us a good conceptual framework. The 4 enablers are, first, innovating. This is that capacity to question the status quo, challenge assumptions, generate new ideas and perspectives.
Thinking differently.
Second, performing. This is about remaining present and engaged, even under stress, adapting quickly, processing data efficiently, basically learning while you're tackling unfamiliar challenges.
Staying effective under pressure.
Third is reflecting. This means actively seeking out feedback and then dedicating focused energy to really understand your own assumptions, your own behavior, what worked, what didn't, generating deeper self-insight.
Taking the time to process.
And fourth is risking. This is about being willing to pioneer into unknown territory, maybe volunteering for ambiguous roles, being comfortable with progressive risk, not just thrill-seeking, but risk that leads to growth and learning.
Okay, 4 enablers. And what's the single biggest weakness? The derailer that trips up even high-potential leaders.
The derailer is defending. It's that inherent human resistance to becoming closed off or defensive when you're challenged or given critical feedback.
The ego getting in the way.
Pretty much. When a leader becomes highly successful, it's natural to start assuming your way is the right way, maybe the only way. This self-preservation instinct can cause you to shut down to necessary outside feedback, creating this rigid barrier to future learning and growth. The truly adaptive leader has to consciously fight this defensiveness every single day.
That makes sense. Now, to make this even more practical for development, let's look at the Talent 7 model I mentioned. It seems to offer a more granular view of the specific traits. What does this add to the picture?
Yeah, the Talent 7 model is useful because it breaks learning agility down into 7 more actionable dimensions, specific behaviors you can potentially measure and coach for. It makes it a great framework for organizational development planning.
Okay, what are the 7?
It starts, very importantly, with self-insight.
Right.
Really accurately understanding your own capabilities, your weaknesses, your beliefs, your goals. Where are you strong? Where do you need help?
Knowing thyself.
Exactly. And that insight feeds directly into the second one. Feedback responsiveness. This isn't just reflecting, it's actively soliciting feedback, really listening to it, and then taking corrective action based on it without getting defensive or explaining away the critique.
So it's the difference between CCL's reflecting the internal process and Talent 7's responsiveness, the external action based on feedback.
That's a good way to put it, yes. Then we have environmental mindfulness. This is about observing your external surroundings carefully, really attending fully to changing requirements, shifting context, and also regulating your own emotions effectively under pressure. Staying attuned.
Connected to the context.
Right. This links closely to cognitive perspective, the ability to think critically, to embrace difficult, multifaceted issues, and approach situations from a broad, high-level viewpoint. This sounds a lot like the operationalizing of Heifetz's getting on the balcony, doesn't it?
It really does. Okay, what about the internal drive and the outward energy needed?
Those are covered too. There's change alacrity. This is demonstrating genuine curiosity and eagerness to learn new ideas, being truly open-minded, and actually kind of relishing change by seeking out innovative approaches. Not just tolerating change, but seeking it.
Embracing it.
And finally, drive to excel. This is about being motivated by difficult, ambiguous assignments, setting challenging goals for yourself and others, and delivering outstanding results even in new and untested situations. That internal fire.
Yeah.
Combine that drive with interpersonal acumen, the ability to interact effectively with all sorts of diverse people, understand their motives and values, and instill confidence. And you basically have the full profile of a highly learning, agile leader.
Wow, that is a complex, multidimensional capability. So how does a CIO move beyond just assessing these traits on a checklist and actually build this agility, institutionalize it within a large IT organization?
Well, perhaps the single most powerful tool described for cultivating agility is the stretch assignment.
Stretch assignment.
This is about intentional development. CIOs need to deliberately rotate team members into roles that are purposefully just outside their established expertise, outside their comfort zone.
Give me an example.
Okay, maybe taking someone who's a deep infrastructure architect and having them spend a quarter embedded within the data analytics team, or taking a software development manager and having them lead a project working directly with clinical operations staff.
That sounds like it could create some short-term friction, maybe even a hit to productivity, right? Why is that disruption worth the investment?
That's the trade-off, exactly. It is a short-term risk to immediate productivity, but it's worth it because it forces cross-pollination of ideas and perspectives.
Okay.
It forces staff to confront genuinely adaptive challenges they would simply never encounter in their comfortable silo. They learn to empathize with the business side's problems firsthand. They're forced to deal with ambiguity and maybe conflicting priorities. And you're intentionally infusing fresh perspectives into groups that might have become a bit rigid or insular.
So breaking down silos through people.
Precisely. Yes, there's often a recognized short-term dip in productivity when someone's learning a new area. But that cost is viewed as an investment. It's repaid many times over by the long-term gain. A more multi-skilled, resilient, and adaptable workforce overall. And leaders, like Gertrude Van Horn mentioned in the book, also cultivate this by modeling the behavior themselves, maybe attending new training programs like design thinking, right alongside their direct reports. That signals that continuous learning isn't just for junior staff, it's non-negotiable for everyone, regardless of rank.
Okay, we've grounded the theory, we've talked about the crucial human capital aspect, the learning agility. Now let's turn to the really practical, maybe even tactical tools that CIOs use day in, day out to maintain speed and resilience, especially when things get really intense, like during a cyber crisis. Let's start with that decision-making cycle known as the ODA loop.
Ah, the ODA loop. Yes. Observe, orient, decide, act. It's a really rapid decision framework. It was originally designed by military strategist Colonel John Boyd specifically for fighter pilots in dogfights.
Fighter pilots, wow.
Yeah. Its entire purpose is to push leaders to cycle through decisions faster than their adversaries. Or, in our context, faster than the environment's turbulence is changing. It's almost a perfect countermeasure to the volatile aspect of VUCA.
Okay, walk us through that cycle. How would it apply in a contemporary IT crisis? Say, a major system goes down unexpectedly.
Okay, system down. The CIO or the incident commander immediately kicks off the loop. First, observe. Rapidly gather only the essential, critical information. What's the current status? What are the key error messages? Who is impacted right now? Just the facts.
No time for deep analysis yet.
Not yet. Next comes orient. This is the crucial cognitive phase. You have to quickly analyze the data you just observed, maybe consult your established incident response playbooks, contextualize the threat. Is this a technical bug, a capacity issue, or could it be an intrusion? And you consider the menu of possible immediate actions.
Making sense of it quickly.
Very quickly. Then decide. Based on that orientation, you choose the critical path forward right now. Maybe it's reverting to a known good configuration. Maybe it's isolating the affected network segment. You make the call.
And finally, act.
Act. You implement that decision immediately, pull the trigger.
And the real power of the ODA loop, as I understand it, is that the act phase immediately feeds back into observe, right? It starts a continuous iterative cycle. It's built for constant course correction.
That's exactly it. It forces speed, disciplined action, and continuous learning from the results of your actions. But, and this is really important for listeners preparing for C-suite roles, understanding the limitations is just as critical as understanding the tool itself.
Okay, what are the limits?
Well, ODF fundamentally assumes that cycling faster is always beneficial. That's great in a dogfight or maybe a fast-moving cyber attack. However, trying to use ODF for a really complex long-term strategic decision like selecting a multi-million-dollar ERP system or redesigning a core business process that could be reckless.
Why? Too fast.
Because if the orient phase is rushed, or if it's based on flawed assumptions or incomplete data, the organization can end up rapidly accelerating in completely the wrong direction. You waste huge amounts of resources, burn out staff, chasing a bad decision made too quickly. So it requires really mature situational awareness from the leader to know when to use ODF for speed versus when you absolutely need to slow down for deeper analysis, consensus building, maybe some systems thinking.
Okay, that makes sense. That need for speed and responsiveness also seems to drive a fundamental shift in how organizations approach long-term planning, moving CIOs away from those static documents towards what the chapter calls short horizon planning.
Yes, this is a direct response to the uncertain nature of VUCA and maybe the nonlinear aspect of BANI too. Those rigid 3 to 5 year IT master plans, they're basically dead on arrival in today's world.
Obsolete before the ink is dry.
Pretty much. Adaptive CIOs are shifting towards rolling, maybe 18-month roadmaps. These are living documents. They use clearly defined quarterly objectives and key results. OKRs are popular here, and execution often happens in focused biweekly sprints.
And the primary benefit there is the ability to incorporate new information almost instantly.
Precisely. It allows the leadership team, the whole organization really, to respond to unexpected technological breakthroughs, sudden competitive market shifts, or maybe just changes in internal business priorities much, much faster. A fantastic example given is Pamela Aurora, who was the CIO at Children's Health in Dallas.
Right, the EMR example again.
Exactly. She took their absolutely mission-critical electronic medical records system, something you don't mess with lightly, and moved it from these slow, incredibly disruptive annual upgrade cycles.
Like bang upgrades.
Yeah, the kind everyone dreads. She moved it to quarterly upgrade cycles, smaller, more frequent updates. This broke that pattern of massive, infrequent, high-risk change and introduced smaller, more manageable disruptions. And critically, it delivered new features and clinical advancements to the doctors and nurses much faster.
That incremental approach sounds like it minimizes risk while maximizing responsiveness. But if everything is constantly shifting focus quarter by quarter, how does the organization maintain any kind of long-term strategic direction? Doesn't it just become chaos?
That is the core challenge, isn't it? It's the risk of strategic drift or fragmentation. If the focus is always just on the next sprint, the next quarter's deliverables, you absolutely can lose sight of the long-term North Star.
So how does the adaptive CIO prevent that?
They have to mitigate it consciously. First, by maintaining a really strong, consistent, and constantly communicated long-term vision. That's the anchor, the V for vision, countering VUCA's volatility. Second, they use those quarterly objectives, the OKRs, to explicitly check progress against that long-term vision. And third, they maintain incredibly high transparency, constantly educating stakeholders on why the short-term tactics might be adjusting frequently, but how it still aligns with the overarching strategy.
Okay, let's really use that children's health EMR transformation as our complete case study here, because it seems to perfectly illustrate putting Heifetz's adaptive behaviors into practice. Implementing an EMR, as you said, required changing long-standing clinical practices, a massive adaptive challenge. How did Aurora actually mobilize that system?
Well, first and foremost, she led through influence over authority. Recognizing the core challenge wasn't technical installation but clinical workflow change, she deliberately ensured that the business stakeholders, the physician advisory councils, the nurse councils, were given explicit ownership of defining the new clinical standards and workflows.
So IT didn't dictate the clinical side.
No, its role was intentionally reframed. They were positioned as the technical coaches, the enablers, the support system, not the dictators of how medicine should be practiced. This was the ultimate act of giving the work back to the people, as Heifetz would say. The solutions, the new workflows, were owned by the clinicians who had to live with them every day.
Okay, that makes sense for buy-in. But how did she manage the inevitable conflicts, the turf wars, the delays that often kill these huge, complex projects?
By bringing data and clarity to the table, specifically by communicating the cost of indecision. She didn't just bang the table and say, you need to decide faster. She and her team quantified the impact of delays. They showed how continued indecision inflated implementation costs, how it deferred critical patient safety benefits that the new system offered, how it slowed down the hospital's overall mission. This is a really smart adaptive move. It helps regulate the distress around making a choice by bringing clarity to the ambiguity of the consequences. It drove timely consensus through a shared understanding of what inaction was actually costing them.
Using data to overcome resistance. And finally, what about the structural outcome? How did this massive project actually build long-term organizational capacity beyond just getting the EMR live?
It essentially served as a massive, enterprise-wide, intentional stretch assignment. The IT staff, the analysts, the project managers who really excelled in that highly ambiguous, highly cross-functional environment of the EMR transformation, dealing with demanding clinicians, complex workflows, constant change, they were later deliberately seeded into new business units that were created outside of the traditional IT department.
Oh, interesting. Like where?
Specifically, the book mentions a new analytics division and a new transformation office were formed, and key leaders and staff for those came from the pool of people who had proven their adaptive leadership skills during the EMR project.
So it allowed leadership to emerge organically.
Exactly. It allowed leadership talent to emerge and be recognized outside of IT's direct control. This fostered what you might call systemness, building multi-skilled leaders who understood both technology and clinical operations, leaders who could operate across the entire enterprise. It perfectly aligns with the ideas of emergent leadership from complexity leadership theory. So we've spent a lot of time establishing why adaptation is so essential, why agility is key. But, the best leaders, the really seasoned ones, they understand that it's not a magic bullet. It's actually a high wire act. Pursuing agility relentlessly without critical analysis, without balance, can quickly lead to exhaustion, wasted resources, even chaos.
Right, there have to be downsides or tensions.
Exactly. We need to look critically at the required balancing act.
Okay, so the first critical tension highlighted is adaptability versus strategic clarity. How do you stop that constant pivoting, the constant adjustment of tactics from completely eroding the foundational long-term strategy?
Yeah, this is a huge risk. It's the danger of getting caught in the whirlpool of change, constantly chasing every shiny new AI tool, every market trend, just because you can pivot quickly.
Right, the shiny object syndrome.
Exactly. It wastes resources, it confuses the heck out of stakeholders, and honestly, it fundamentally breaks employee engagement if the direction seems to change every week. So the adaptive CIO has to adopt what's often called an emergent strategy.
Emergent strategy, meaning?
Meaning they hold a long-term, powerful vision, the North Star, relatively loosely, provides direction. But they consciously allow the specific tactics, the execution roadmap, the path to that star to adjust and emerge based on new signals from the market, from customers, from technology.
Okay, but I can just imagine traditional stakeholders, maybe the CFO, the board, they often expect certainty, right? Detailed, multi-year financial projections, fixed plans. How does a CIO manage that expectation mismatch?
That's where the CIO's political and communication skills become paramount. It requires a massive, ongoing education effort. The CIO has to constantly advocate for flexibility, explaining why, in a VU Kabani world, a detailed, locked-in 5-year plan is largely a work of fiction. The real value, they argue, lies in institutionalizing the process of learning and pivoting effectively.
So selling the capability, not just the plan.
Exactly. It's an argument for organizational resilience over rigid planning. But it absolutely forces the CIO to be not just a technologist, but a persuasive educator and, frankly, a political leader within the C-suite.
Okay. The second tension you mentioned earlier is the agile reality check. This requires a really hard look at where agile methodologies actually make sense and where they don't.
Yes, we have to return to the need for contextual judgment. While we rightly praise agile leadership for its benefits in certain areas, not every process in the enterprise can or even should be agile.
Like where specifically?
Think about highly regulated environments. Pharmaceutical manufacturing systems, maybe? Critical infrastructure controls, like a nuclear power plant's monitoring systems? Or fundamental financial reporting systems that have strict audit requirements.
Okay. High stakes, low error tolerance areas.
Exactly. In these kinds of environments, traditional controls, rigorous compliance checks, detailed documentation, maybe heavyweight stage gate processes, these are often inherently superior to rapid, iterative, fail-fast approaches.
Why is that? What's the fundamental difference?
Because in those areas, the cost of failure is simply too catastrophic. The absolute priority has to be control, stability, predictability, and standardization, not necessarily speed or innovation in the process itself. The truly adaptive CIO demonstrates their wisdom by knowing when to champion agile methods and when to be the firm, maybe even seemingly rigid, champion of compliance and traditional controls. Failure to make that crucial distinction, applying agile inappropriately, could mean putting the entire organization at massive risk of regulatory breach, financial misstatement, or even catastrophic systems failure, all in the name of following the latest management fad.
So adapting the approach itself. Finally, let's tackle the most human tension, the ethical and human toll of constant change. This connects right back to that Band-Aid concept of anxiety, doesn't it? Relentless adaptation must be exhausting for the workforce.
Oh, absolutely. That anxious component of BNI isn't just theoretical. It's a direct result of people experiencing relentless, often unpredictable change. Burnout is real. CIOs have to consciously balance the drive for rapid innovation, introducing potentially disruptive technologies like large language models or significant automation with a genuine empathy and a profound sense of responsibility toward their staff.
Because innovation without a human strategy is doomed.
It leads directly to burnout, fear, resistance, and ultimately high attrition of your best people. You can't be agile if your workforce is constantly stressed and looking for the exit.
So what concrete steps can an adaptive CIO take to mitigate this anxiety, to manage that human toll?
They need to plan for the human impact just as rigorously as they plan for the technical rollout. For every major automation initiative, for example, there needs to be a commensurate, visible investment in retraining, reskilling, and clear career pathing for the staff whose jobs are going to fundamentally change or even disappear.
Showing people a future.
Exactly. They need to actively listen to the concerns bubbling up from the workforce. They need to regulate the distress, partly by communicating transparently why the change is necessary for the organization's survival or success, but also how the organization is going to support the employees through that transition. They have to recognize that if the staff is constantly anxious and fearful, the learning agility of the entire organization gets crippled. People don't learn well when they're afraid.
Okay, so ultimately, it sounds like the adaptive CIO has to wear two hats constantly. Be the forward-looking innovator driving change, and be the custodian of stability and well-being. They need to maintain resilience.
Resilience is really the goal that ties it all together. Resilience is the capacity of the organization, its systems, its people, its processes to absorb shocks, to bend without breaking, and ideally to bounce back stronger. And crucially, resilience must be built proactively, not just wished for during a crisis.
And that's what you called flexible stability earlier.
Exactly. It comes from deliberate investments in systems, things like scalable cloud infrastructure, maybe decentralized platforms that aren't single points of failure, and investments in people like cross-trained personnel, regular disaster simulation exercises, clear communication channels. The case mentioned of the Dallas County Community College District shifting, 80,000 students to 100% online learning in just 1 week during a crisis. That shows the kind of Herculean effort that's possible.
Yeah, that required breaking norms, immense adaptability under incredible pressure.
It absolutely did. But their success wasn't just luck or heroic effort in the moment. It depended heavily on the institutionalized responsiveness they had already built into their system architecture, their staff capabilities, and critically, the willingness of their leadership to empower rapid, distributed decision-making when the crisis hit.
So preparedness met opportunity.
In a sense, yes. The truly adaptive CIO treats IT resiliency and business continuity not as a one-time project you check off a list, but as a continuous practice, something that's regularly tested, simulated, debated, and improved. They use systems thinking to identify where the enterprise's crucial shock absorbers need to be placed in technology, in process, in people, ensuring the whole system can bend and adapt without snapping when the next inevitable VUCA or BNA event hits. Hashtag outro.
Wow. We have covered a huge amount of ground today, a real deep dive into the modern turbulent environment, VUCA and BANI, the core theoretical foundations from Heifetz, complexity theory, agile. We looked at the essential human capacity needed, that learning agility, and the practical tools CIOs use like the OODA loop and short horizon planning.
Yeah, it's a lot, but I think the key insights for any rising IT professional listening are really paramount. The modern CIO's role, it really demands that you learn to influence effectively, often without direct control. You absolutely have to diagnose challenges correctly. Is this technical or is it adaptive? You need to constantly balance that necessary stability with the drive for continuous innovation. And you have to systematically cultivate learning within your organization.
And that includes intentionally pushing teams outside their comfort zones.
Absolutely. Because future success in this environment is going to be predicated on agility, on the ability to learn and adapt, not just on repeating past performance or known solutions.
Well, thank you for tuning in to this deep dive. If this conversation sparked a new way for you to think about IT leadership, maybe moving beyond just command and control towards mobilization, diagnosis, enablement, please consider sharing this deep dive with someone else you know who's preparing for that next major leadership leap.
And maybe reflecting on that need for growth, for risk-taking that builds agility. Ask yourself this question. What specific stretch assignments, something genuinely outside your current functional expertise or comfort zone, maybe stepping up to lead an ambiguous cross-functional project, or volunteering for a critical initiative where failure is a real possibility, what could you take on in the next 3 months to deliberately demonstrate and cultivate your own learning agility?
That's a great, actionable prompt. Remember, technology drives change, but ultimately leadership drives impact. Keep learning, keep growing, and lead the future you want to create.